Tonight's bedtime story comes from Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, modernized for easier listening. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and try not to lose your head.
The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker. A pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky. Castle of Indolence. In the shelter of a broad cove along the eastern shore of the Hudson River, where the great expanse known by old Dutch sailors as the Tappan Zee spreads wide, and where they would prudently shorten sail and pray for the protection of St. Nicholas, there lies a small market town. Some call it Greensburg, but it is better and more rightly known as Tarrytown. They say the name was given long ago by the good wives of the countryside, weary of their husbands' habit of lingering at the tavern on market days. Whether true or not, I repeat the tale only for the sake of accuracy. Not far from this village, perhaps 2 miles or so, nestles a small valley, or rather a gentle hollow between high hills, one of the quietest places in all the world. A brook glides softly through it, whispering just enough to lull one into repose. The call of a quail or the tapping of a woodpecker is nearly all that ever disturbs its perfect stillness. That I remember when I was but a youth. My first adventure in squirrel hunting took place beneath a grove of tall walnut trees that shaded one side of the vale. I had wandered there at noon, when all nature seems hushed, and the sudden roar of my gun startled me with its echoing fury, rolling through the hills like a profanation of the Sabbath calm. If ever I were to seek a retreat from the world and its weary noise, to dream away the last of my troubled days in peace, I know of no place more fit than that secluded valley. From the drowsy air that hangs over it, and the unhurried ways of its inhabitants, descendants of the earliest Dutch settlers, this hidden glen has long been known as Sleepy Hollow. Its rustic youths are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout the neighboring country. A sleepy spell seems to rest upon the land itself, sinking into the very air. Some claim the valley was bewitched by a learned German doctor in the settlement's early days. Others whisper that a great Indian shaman held his sacred rites there, long before Hendrik Hudson's discovery. Whatever the cause, the place still lies under an unseen charm that bends the minds of its people toward visions and enchantments. As if in reverie, they believe strange things, see lights and shapes in the night, and hear mysterious voices in the air. The whole region overflows with local legends, haunted places, and twilight superstitions. Shooting stars and meteors blaze more often above this hollow than anywhere else in the land, and the nightmare herself seems to choose it as the favorite ground for her ghostly games. But the ruling spirit of all, the dread commander of these airy powers, is said to be the apparition of a headless horseman. Some call him the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head was carried off by a cannonball during some forgotten battle of the Revolution. Some he is seen galloping through the gloom of night, as if riding on the very wind. His wanderings are not confined to the hollow, for he is said to haunt the roads beyond, especially near a certain church not far away. According to the most solemn historians of the region, the trooper's body was buried in that churchyard, and each night his restless spirit rides forth to search for his lost head upon the field of battle. The furious speed with which he sometimes thunders through the hollow, like a storm wind at midnight, is said to be from haste, as the ghost must return to the graveyard before dawn. Yet I speak of Sleepy Hollow with admiration. It is in such small, hidden Dutch valleys, tucked away within the great state of New York, that old manners, faces, and traditions remain unchanging, while the tide of progress and restlessness sweeps past unnoticed. They are like the rolled, still eddies along the bank of a rushing stream, where leaves and bubbles drift quietly in their calm circle, untouched by the current. Though many years have passed since I wandered those drowsy shades, I doubt not that the same trees and families still linger there, rooted in the same soil, as tranquil and untroubled as ever. Though many years have passed, and it was in this secluded nook of nature, some 30 years ago, that there dwelt a certain worthy soul by the name of Ichabod Crane. Let it not be imagined that Ichabod Crane was one of those cruel tyrants of the schoolroom who take delight in the pain of their pupils. On the contrary, he dealt justice with discernment rather than severity, lifting the burden from the weak and placing it squarely upon the shoulders of the strong. The frail child, who flinched at the mere sight of the rod, was often spared, but some stubborn, broad-skirted Dutch urchin, thick-headed and defiant, would receive a double share of correction beneath the birch. This, Ichabod declared, was doing his duty by their parents, and he never ended a chastisement without solemnly assuring the tearful culprit that he would one day remember it, and be loathed until his dying hour. When lessons were done, Ichabod became no longer master but companion, playing with the larger boys and escorting the smaller ones home, especially those with fair sisters or mothers famed for generous cupboards. It was wise for him to stay in their good graces, for his earnings as schoolmaster were meager indeed. He was a prodigious eater, with the appetite of an anaconda, in spite of his gaunt and lantern-like frame. According to custom in those parts, he was lodged and fed by the farmers whose children he taught, moving week by week from house to house, his few worldly belongings tied in a cotton handkerchief, so as not to weigh too heavily upon the purses of his rustic patrons, who thought schooling costly and schoolmasters idle drones. Ichabod made himself both useful and agreeable. He lent a hand in the lighter labors of the farm, helping with the hay, mending fences, watering the horses, driving home the cows, or cutting wood for the winter fire. Away from the classroom, he shed all his scholarly authority and became gentle, humble, almost courtly. Mothers smiled upon him, for he doted upon their little ones, rocking cradles with one foot while holding a child upon his knee, a picture of long-limbed devotion. Besides his teaching, Ichabod was the village singing master, earning a tidy sum by instructing the young folk in psalmody. On Sundays he took great pride in standing before the church gallery, leading a chosen band of singers. In his own mind, his voice outshone even the parson's sermon. Indeed, his nasal tones rang so loud and long that echoes of his peculiar quaver were said to drift half a mile across the still mill pond on calm mornings. Ghostly remnants, people joked, of Ichabod Crane's nose. Thus, by many small devices, by hook and by crook, as the saying goes, the worthy pedagogue managed to live tolerably well, and was thought by those who knew nothing of mental labor to lead a life of enviable ease. Thus now, the country schoolmaster holds a place of some consequence in any rural neighborhood, an idle yet refined gentleman, of superior manners to the rough young farmers, and second in learning only to the parson himself. His arrival at a farmhouse tea was enough to cause a flutter among the womenfolk, often earning him an extra plate of cakes, or even the grand display of a silver teapot. Ichabod was well aware of his advantage, and was particularly favored by the smiles of the village maidens. How he would strut among them in the churchyard between Sunday services, gathering grapes from the wild vines, reciting epitaphs for their amusement, or strolling with a whole circle of them along the mill pond shore, while the bashful lads of the countryside lingered behind, scowling in envy at his polished airs. Because of his wandering life from house to house, Ichabod was a kind of living gazette, carrying gossip and tidings wherever he went. His arrival was always welcomed, for he was thought a man of deep learning. He had, after all, read several books from cover to cover, and was a devoted scholar of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which he most solemnly and wholeheartedly believed. In truth, Ichabod Crane was a curious mixture of cleverness and credulity. His hunger for the marvelous was as great as his ability to believe it, and both were sharpened by his time in that enchanted valley. No void was too wild for him to swallow whole. Often, after dismissing school at dusk, he would stretch himself upon a bed of clover by the murmuring brook beside his schoolhouse, reading Mather's dreadful accounts of witches and specters until the print blurred into shadow. Then, as twilight deepened, he would make his lonely way through swamp and woodland toward his lodgings, every sound stirring his overwrought imagination. The mournful call of the whippoorwill from the hill, the ominous cry of the tree-toad, the hollow hoot of an owl, or the sudden flutter of frightened birds. Fireflies gleaming through the dark would startle him, and the blundering flight of a beetle might send him trembling, sure he'd been struck by a witch's charm. On such moments of terror, his only refuge was to sing psalm tunes into the night, his voice long and nasal, floating eerily down the lanes, so that the good folk of Sleepy Hollow, hearing it from afar, would cross themselves and whisper of spirits abroad. His favorite delight, however, was to pass winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they spun by the fire, a row of roasting apples sputtering on the hearth. There he would sit, wide-eyed, drinking in their tales of haunted houses, bewitched fields, and ghostly riders. Above all, the legend of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow. In return, he would regale them with stories of witchcraft from his native Connecticut, filling the room with gasps as he spoke of comets, omens, and the dreadful truth that the earth itself turned round, so that they were half the time upside down. But these pleasures of warmth and wonder had their price. When the stories ended and the fire burned low, Ichabod had to walk home through the snow-draped dark. What strange forms and phantom shapes haunted his path then? How he would peer longingly at the faint gleam of a distant window, or freeze in terror before some snow-laden shrub that looked, in moonlight, like a shrouded ghost. The crunch of his own footsteps made him start. He dared not glance behind, lest he see some shadowy pursuer. And when the winter wind came rushing through the trees, he could swear it was the Headless Horseman himself, thundering after him through the night. Yet come morning, all such fears melted away. The sunlight chased off the phantoms, and Ichabod's life would have been a peaceful one, despite witches and demons, had it not been for that most mysterious and perilous of all beings ever to trouble a man's heart, a woman. Among the young villagers who gathered each week to learn the solemn art of psalm singing, one stood out beyond all others, Katrina Van Tassel, the only child and cherished daughter of a prosperous Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of 18, plump as a partridge, warm and radiant as one of her father's ripest peaches. Her cheeks glowed with the color of late summer, and she was admired far and wide, not only for her beauty, but for the considerable inheritance that would one day be hers. She was, however, something of a coquette. It showed in her lively eyes, her playful smile, and even in her dress, a faintly amused rhythm, a teasing blend of the old Dutch style and the newer fashions of the time, chosen with cunning care to set off her charms. Around her neck and wrists gleamed ornaments of pure yellow gold, heirlooms brought long ago from Sardam by her great-great-grandmother. A bodice of antique design drew the eye to her figure, and her petticoat, scandalously short by the modest measure of the countryside, revealed the prettiest foot and ankle in all the Hudson Valley. Now Ichabod Crane, though lean of form and long of limb, possessed a heart that melted easily at the sight of beauty. It is little wonder that this tempting vision soon ensnared him completely, especially after his first visit to the Van Tassel homestead. Old Baltus Van Tassel was the picture of a contented and generous farmer. He cared little for the world beyond the borders of his land. His happiness was bounded by the fences he himself had built. With Usnem, all was neat, well-stocked, and prosperous. He took pride not in wealth or finery, but in the hearty abundance that surrounded him. Well, the true measure of Dutch comfort. His home stood on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, fertile nooks where the Dutch farmers loved to settle. A mighty elm stretched its limbs protectively over the house, and at its foot bubbled a clear spring, captured in a barrel well, spilling forth to feed a brook that murmured gently through the meadow. Close beside the house rose a barn so vast it might well have served as a church. Every crevice seemed to overflow with the riches of the farm. From dawn till dusk, the steady rhythm of the flail echoed within, while swallows and martins darted through the air around the eaves. On the roof, rows of pigeons basked in the sunlight, some turning one bright eye skyward, some nestling with heads tucked beneath their wings, others cooing and bowing with courtly airs to their mates. In the pens, great fat hogs grunted in their contentment, while legions of piglets trotted out to sniff the air. A stately regiment of white geese glided across the pond, escorting flotillas of ducks, while turkeys gobbled through the yard and guinea fowls scolded one another in shrill discontent, like quarrelsome housewives. And presiding over all strutted the proud cock himself, soldier, father, and monarch of his little realm, beating his shining wings, crowing with bold delight, tearing at the earth with his claws, then calling magnanimously to his brood to share in the treasure he had uncovered. At this sight, Ichabod's mouth fairly watered. His hungry imagination transformed the farmyard into a banquet. Every squealing piglet became a roasting pig, stuffed with pudding and crowned with an apple. The pigeons, he fancied, lay snug in golden-crusted pies. The geese swam in their own gravy. The ducks reclined in fragrant onion sauce, like plump couples before a winter hearth. From the porkers he carved thick slabs of bacon and shining hams. Every turkey was trussed and glistening, with a necklace of sausages for good measure. Even the proud rooster himself, he imagined, lay sprawling upon a platter, those same triumphant claws now raised in surrender, his courage at last undone by the cook's knife. Such were the delicious dreams that feasted upon the mind of Ichabod Crane, as he gazed upon the plenty of the Van Tassel farm, and upon the fair young heiress who would inherit it all. As the enraptured Ichabod let his hungry imagination feast, his great green eyes wandered over the bounty spread before him. The fat meadowlands, the ripened fields of wheat and rye and buckwheat, the tall stalks of Indian corn, and the orchards heavy with glowing fruit. Around Van Tassel's warm and well-kept home stretched a vision of earthly plenty, and Ichabod's heart swelled with longing, not only for the fair Katrina, who would inherit it all, but for the prosperous ease that would follow in her dowry. In his mind's theater, he saw it all transformed, the fields turned to gold, the harvest converted to coin, the coin into broad tracts of wilderness land, and timbered mansions of his own devising. Already, his fancy played out the scene of his triumph. There was Katrina, rosy and smiling, perched atop a wagon piled with kettles, trunks, and homely treasures, a brood of merry children tumbling about her, while Ichabod himself bestrode a steady mare, a colt frisking at her side, as they set out together for the western frontier, Kentucky, Tennessee, or some other untamed paradise where fortune awaited. And when he crossed the threshold of Van Tassel's home, a faint hush in tone, his surrender was complete. The house was one of those broad, low-roofed dwellings, built in the solid Dutch fashion of the old country, its high ridge sloping down to deep eaves that formed a wide piazza along the front, shelter by day and a retreat in stormy weather. From the beams hung farm tools, nets for the river, and harness polished by use. Benches ran along the walls for summer idling, while at one end stood a great spinning wheel, and at the other, a churn, tokens of the household's endless industry. From this porch, Ichabod stepped into the great central hall, the living heart of the home. His eyes were dazzled by the gleam of polished pewter, lined in proud array along the dresser. In one corner lay a bulging sack of wool waiting for the wheel. In another, a heap of homespun cloth, fresh from the loom. Strings of dried apples and peaches hung like garlands along the walls, mingled with braids of bright red peppers. Through a half-open door he caught a glimpse of the best room, a parlor so spotless and still it seemed a shrine. There the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. The brass andirons glittered beneath their veil of asparagus tops, and the mantelpiece bloomed with mock oranges and seashells. Above hung strings of colored birds' eggs, and from the very ceiling, a great ostrich egg swayed gently in pride of place. In the corner cupboard, left open, surely not by accident, sparkled old silver and china, neatly mended, but more precious for its age. At that sight, Ichabod's peace of mind deserted him forever. From that moment, his every waking thought was consumed with winning the favor of Katrina Van Tassel. Yet his was no easy quest. The heroes of old had only to slay dragons, outwit enchanters, or storm fortresses of stone to win their ladies' hands. Ichabod's task was far subtler and far more perilous. He must navigate the whims of a capricious country beauty whose heart was besieged by rivals of flesh and blood. Around her hovered a whole army of rustic suitors, each guarding his claim, each watching the others with jealousy, but united in their hostility toward any new contender. Foremost among these was a burly young hero of the countryside, Abraham Van Brunt, better known by his nickname, Brom Bones. He was the very image of rustic strength and swagger, broad-shouldered, double-jointed, with curling black hair and a ruddy face that blended mischief and good humor. He was feats of brawn and horsemanship were the talk of every tavern. In the saddle, none could match him. In a race or a cockfight, he was always first. His voice carried authority in every quarrel, and with the easy confidence of his might, he settled disputes as though by royal decree. Brom was quick to laughter, quicker to fight, but even his roughest jests carried more mirth than malice. He led aloft kindred spirits, roaring companions who followed him from frolic to fray across the countryside. When winter came, his fur cap crowned with a fox's tail was a signal of mischief, and when, at midnight, the thunder of hooves and a chorus of whoops echoed down the valley, the old wives, roused from sleep, would mutter, "There goes Brom Bones and his gang." It was this formidable figure who had long pursued the coquettish Katrina. His courtship was as blunt as his manner, his playful wrestling, his boisterous teasing, the rough affections of a bear. Yet it was whispered that the girl did not entirely discourage his advances. Indeed, when Brom's horse was seen tied at the Van Tassel gate on a Sunday evening, the other suitors prudently turned aside, preferring to seek their fortunes elsewhere, rather than risk the wrath of a man they all feared and admired. Such was the rival Ichabod Crane faced. A stronger man might have quailed, a wiser man, perhaps, would have retreated. But Ichabod possessed a strange resilience. Like a sapling whip, he could bend low without breaking, yielding to the moment only to spring upright again. To challenge Brom Bones openly would have been folly. So Ichabod pursued a gentler stratagem. Cloaked in his role as singing master, he made frequent visits to the Van Tassel farm, where he found no obstacle in the parents. Old Bolt was a good-natured soul, loving his daughter even more than his pipe, and wisely letting her follow her fancy. His busy wife had her hands full with the poultry yard, for, as she liked to say, ducks and geese are foolish creatures that must be watched, but girls can mind themselves. Thus, while the dame busied herself at her spinning wheel, and Bolt smoked his evening pipe, gazing dreamily at the weather vane atop his barn, Ichabod would wander with Katrina by the spring beneath the great elm, or stroll beside her through the dimming light of twilight, the hour when even the shyest lover finds his tongue loosed, and the world around seems made for whispering hearts. I confess, I have never fully understood the mysterious art by which a woman's heart is won. To me, it has ever been a puzzle wrapped in admiration. Some women seem to have but a single point of entry, a narrow gate through which the conqueror must pass. Others possess 1,000 hidden avenues, each guarded by whim and mood, and a man must besiege them all if he hopes to prevail. To win the first is a feat of skill, to hold the second, a masterstroke of strategy. Many may claim glory for capturing common hearts, but he who gains and keeps dominion over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero.
Such triumph, however, was not to be Brom Bones's. From the moment Ichabod Crane entered the lists, the balance of favor shifted. Brom's horse was no longer seen tied at the Van Tassel gate on Sunday evenings, and a cold hostility grew between the burly gallant and the lank schoolmaster of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, for all his rough manners, possessed a certain rustic chivalry, and would gladly have settled the affair by the straightforward means of a knight of old, by single combat. But Ichabod, knowing well the peril of such an encounter, wisely declined. He had once overheard Brom boast that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and Ichabod had no desire to test the truth of it. This patient avoidance only provoked Brom further, leaving him no choice but to vent his temper through mischief. Ichabod soon found himself the victim of all manner of pranks and persecutions. Brom and his band of roistering riders tormented him with a spirit of rustic devilry, smoking him out of his singing school by clogging the chimney, breaking into the classroom at night and turning everything topsy-turvy, until the poor pedagogue half believed the witches of the region held their nightly gatherings there. Starting worst of all, Brom mocked him before Katrina herself, once bringing along a mangy cur trained to whine and howl in mock imitation of Ichabod's nasal singing voice. There, for a time, this war of wits continued without victory for either side. But fate, at last, conspired to move matters forward. One golden afternoon in early autumn, Ichabod Crane sat at his high stool, the throne from which he ruled his small dominion of scholars. In his hand he held the ferule, that scepter of discipline. Behind him hung the dread birch rod, its very presence enough to maintain order. On the desk before him lay a collection of confiscated treasures, half-eaten apples, toy pop-guns, spinning whirligigs, and little cages for captured flies, all evidence of rebellion, sternly suppressed. The hush that filled the room was the silence that follows judgment. Every pupil bent low over his book, every whisper stilled, save for the faint buzz of fear. Ichabod Crane. Then came a sudden clatter at the door, amused and vivid. A young Negro messenger, dressed in coarse tow-cloth and mounted on a ragged colt, rode up in great haste. He delivered, with comic dignity, an invitation to a quilting frolic that very evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's farm, then galloped off again, full of self-importance and speed. The schoolhouse instantly erupted into chaos. Lessons were rushed through in half the time. The nimble skipped whole pages unpunished, while the slow were driven on by brisk encouragements to the rear. Books were thrown aside, ink splattered, benches overturned, and in a moment the yard was alive with shrieking, liberated children, leaping and whooping like a legion of imps freed from enchantment. Meanwhile Ichabod lingered, preparing for conquest. He spent a good half-hour longer than usual at his mirror, a small cracked shard of glass nailed to the wall, brushing and straightening his one black suit until it shone faintly in the fading light. His lank hair he smoothed carefully behind his ears, and his long, bony frame he arrayed with all the ceremony of a knight girding for battle. Since he lacked a steed of his own, he borrowed one from his host, a surly old Dutch farmer named Hans van Ripper. The horse was a relic of better days, a gaunt, high-boned plow beast named Gunpowder, whose only surviving virtues were cunning and spite. His neck was long and bent like a bow, his mane matted with burrs, and one eye had gone milky with age. while the other glimmered with devilish fire. Yet, in his youth he had been a spirited creature, and perhaps some spark of his old master's temper still lingered in him. Ichabod made an odd figure upon this steed. His stirrups were so short that his knees nearly touched the saddle's pommel. His sharp elbows jutted out like wings, and as he jogged along the road, the motion of his limbs gave him the look of a great scarecrow come to life. His small hat perched precariously atop his long nose, and the tails of his coat fluttered behind him, almost to the horse's tail. It was, indeed, a spectacle, such a one as might cause travellers to cross themselves at noonday. The day was splendidly clear, the kind of autumn afternoon when the whole world seems wrapped in gold. The forests blazed with colour, their leaves touched by the hand of frost into hues of crimson, amber, and purple. Wild ducks flew in glinting lines high overhead. Squirrels barked from the hickories, and from the stubble fields came the wistful call of the quail. Ichabod rode slowly, his hungry eyes devouring the signs of harvest. Apples hung in heavy clusters, or lay piled high in barrels for cider pressing. Cornfields stood in rustling rows, their golden ears peeking from green husks. Beneath them sprawled bright pumpkins, plump and glowing in the sun, each one, to Ichabod's mind, a promise of steaming pies. The air itself was sweet with the scent of ripened buckwheat, mingled with the warm perfume of hay and hives. Ichabod rode. As he beheld all this abundance, a vision came to him, of a table laden with feasts, of rich buttered cakes and honeyed pancakes served by a dimpled hand, and of Katrina Van Tassel smiling across it all. Thus, dreaming of love and supper in equal measure, the gallant schoolmaster trotted on toward his fate, beneath the golden sky of Sleepy Hollow. Thus feeding his mind with sweet dreams and sugared imaginings, Ichabod journeyed along the slopes of the Hudson Hills, where the land opens in grand and solemn beauty upon the river's broad expanse. The sun, like a glowing shield, drifted slowly down the western sky. Below him, the Tappan Zee lay glassy and still, disturbed only by the faintest ripples that deepened the blue shadows of the distant mountains. A few amber clouds drifted idly overhead, and the horizon melted from gold into soft green, and from green into the tranquil blue of twilight's vault. Along the high cliffs, the sun's last rays caught the treetops, gilding their edges and deepening the purples of the rocky walls beneath. Out upon the water, a lone sloop floated with the tide, her sail hanging slack and lifeless, until she seemed suspended between heaven and the mirrored river below. It was toward evening when Ichabod arrived at the estate of Heer Van Tassel, a cheerful fortress of plenty, and found it alive with guests, the pride and flower of the countryside. There were the old Dutch farmers, leathery of face and thin of frame, in their homespun coats, blue stockings, and shining pewter buckles. Their brisk little wives, trim and tight in their caps and petticoats, bustled about with scissors and pincushions at their waists, their gay calico pockets swinging from their sides. The buxom daughters, scarcely less plump or rosy than their mothers, were brightened by ribbons and straw hats, small tokens of modern fashion among their rustic finery. The young men strutted about in short, square-skirted coats, blazing with brass buttons, their hair tied behind in neat queues, some boasting eel-skin ribbons, believed to endow the wearer with both strength and shine of hair. But among them all, the figure of Brom Bones stood out, like a young warlord among his clan. He had arrived astride his infamous steed, Daredevil, a creature as wild and willful as its master. None but Brom could ride him. Indeed, the man preferred such beasts, ill-tempered, unbroken, half-demonic things that kept their riders in constant peril. To Brom Bones, a gentle horse was fit only for cowards.
And now, dear listener, I could linger long upon the delights that awaited Ichabod within that house, yet not upon the rosy cheeks of the Dutch maidens, but upon the true object of his devotion, the overflowing tea table of the season. It was autumn, the Dutch housewives' triumph. There, laid out in glorious abundance, were cakes of every name and nature, thick doughnuts, tender olykoeks, crisp, twisted crullers. There were sweet cakes and shortcakes, gingerbread and honey cakes, until the very air seemed sugared with their perfume. Round them lay apple pies, peach pies, pumpkin pies, pies of every hue and promise. Platters of smoked beef and shining hams gleamed beside jars of preserved peaches, pears, and quinces. Roasted chickens browned to perfection, and bowls of milk and cream shone white as moonlight. In the center, the great teapot sent up its fragrant steam, like an altar offering to plenty itself. Your humble narrator admits he has not breath enough to do justice to such a feast, but Ichabod Crane had both breath and appetite aplenty. Though of each mouthful his heart expanded like a bellows, joy rose in him as wine rises in the veins of merrier souls. Between bites, his eyes rolled in satisfied wonder, roaming over the silver gleam of pewter, the glow of candlelight, and the bustling warmth of good company. And as he chewed and dreamed, he imagined himself the future lord of this abundant domain, the master of orchards, barns, and kitchens overflowing with harvest and laughter. He smiled inwardly at the thought of bidding farewell to the humble schoolhouse forever, of snapping his fingers at old Hans van Ripper and his miserly patrons, of turning away any future pedagogue who might dare call him colleague. Old Baltus Van Tassel himself moved cheerily among his guests, round and ruddy as the harvest moon, his face shining with good humor. His hospitality needed no words, only a hearty handshake, a friendly slap on the shoulder, and the jovial command, "Fall to, friends! Eat and be merry!" Then came the sound of the fiddle from the great hall, the summons to dance. The musician was an ancient Negro fiddler, the traveling minstrel of the region, who had played at every wedding and festival within 50 miles for half a century. His heart, violin, scarred and weary as its master, sang and squeaked under the bow. His head nodded to the rhythm, and his foot stamped time upon the floor, as he called forth couples with a spirited grin. Ichabod, who prided himself no less on his dancing than on his singing, leapt eagerly into the fray. His long limbs swung and flapped in every direction, his coat-tails flying, his whole frame moving with frantic zeal. To the onlookers, especially the crowd of wide-eyed Negro children peering from door and window, he was a marvel of motion, a living whirlwind, a scarecrow possessed by the spirit of St. Vitus himself. And there, radiant before him, was Katrina Van Tassel, smiling, blushing, her eyes bright with mischief, her hand resting in his as they whirled together beneath the rafters. In the corner, Brom Bones sat apart, his great arms folded, his face dark with jealousy, his heart burning as he watched the schoolmaster claim the lady of his desire. When the last tune faded, Ichabod, flushed and triumphant, drifted out to the veranda where the older men sat in a haze of pipe smoke. There, old Baltus Van Tassel and his cronies traded tales of the Revolution, of skirmishes and ambushes, of brave deeds and narrow escapes. It was a place rich in stories and heroes, for the war had passed near Sleepy Hollow, leaving behind both scars and legends. The old men told of Dofu Martling, the blue-bearded Dutchman who nearly captured a British frigate with a single cannon before it exploded in his face, and of the unnamed Mynheer, who swore he had deflected a musket ball with his sword at White Plains, and still displayed the bent hilt as proof. Each tale grew taller with the telling, each veteran the greater hero in his own recollection. And Ichabod Crane listened wide-eyed, his imagination already weaving these mortal tales into something far more ghostly to come. But all these hearty tales of war and valor were soon forgotten when the talk turned to that darker subject for which the valley was famed: ghosts and apparitions. No countryside in all the Hudson Valley was so rich in spectral lore as this one. Old stories thrive best where generations linger long upon the same soil, where the old elms shade the same doorsteps and the same names echo in the churchyard for 100 years. Such legends wither in restless towns, where the living move away before the dead have finished their first sleep. A ghost, it seems, must have acquaintances to haunt, and in these deep-rooted Dutch settlements, the departed still found plenty of friends to frighten. The true heart of such mystery lay, of course, in Sleepy Hollow itself. The air there was heavy with dreams. It drifted across the hills like a faint enchantment, infecting all who breathed it. That his voice narrowing in focus. That night, several of the Hollow folk were present at Van Tassel's gathering, and they spun their grim tales with practiced ease. However, there were murmurs of phantom funeral processions winding through the woods, of mournful cries heard beneath the old tree where Major Andre had been captured, and which still cast its shadow over the land like a mark of doom. There were one spoke of the woman in white, who haunted the glen of Raven Rock, her shrieks rising on winter nights before a storm, as though her spirit still battled the snows that had claimed her life. Yet most of all, they spoke of the specter that ruled over every other, the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. He had been really heard again, they said, galloping by moonlight across the hills, tethering his horse among the churchyard graves, before vanishing with the dawn. The church itself, lonely and time-worn, seemed built for ghostly visitations. It stood upon a small green knoll, surrounded by drooping locusts and tall elms. Its whitewashed walls gleamed modestly through the leaves, like the face of innocence peering out from solitude. Below it lay a quiet brook, winding through the meadow toward the Hudson, its waters silver under moonlight. The churchyard sloped gently down to meet it, the graves peaceful under their blanket of grass, where even the sunlight seemed to slumber. One might have thought the dead could rest there undisturbed forever. But beyond the churchyard stretched a dark, tangled dell, where the brook rushed over fallen trunks and rocks. Across one deep, shadowed part of this stream stood a wooden bridge, long, narrow, and hemmed in by overhanging boughs. Even by day it was gloomy, but by night it became a place of dread. The country folk whispered that the Headless Horseman most often appeared there, and that none who met him upon that bridge returned without terror in his soul. Old Brower, a notorious scoffer at such tales, once swore that he himself had ridden home with the phantom, returning late one night from Sleepy Hollow. He was overtaken by a rider who carried no head upon his shoulders. The stranger motioned him to mount behind. Brower, thinking it a jest, complied, only to find himself hurled through wood and swamp at a frightful speed. When they reached the bridge, the ghostly horseman turned suddenly into a skeleton, flung the poor wretch into the stream, and vanished over the trees. This was followed by an even bolder tale from Brombones, who declared that he too had met the galloping Hessian, and had challenged him to a race, for a bowl of punch no less. Daredevil, his wild black horse, had nearly outrun the phantom steed, but at the church bridge the spectre vanished in a burst of fire. Brombones always ended the story with a knowing laugh, as if he understood more of the ghost's nature than he chose to tell. All these tales were murmured in low, hushed voices, the kind men use when shadows gather and pipes glow faintly in the dark. Now and then, a face would flash pale in the ember light, before fading again into obscurity. Ichabod Crane drank in every word. The fire of superstition burned bright within him, fanned by his beloved Cotton Mather and his own nightly wanderings through the bewitched hollow. He answered their tales with grim wonders of his own, from haunted farms in Connecticut to devilish sights glimpsed beneath the moon. At last, the revel broke apart. The wagons rattled down the lanes, their lanterns bobbing among the trees. Laughter,
and hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the chirp of crickets and the whisper of falling leaves. One by one, the house lights dimmed. Only Ichabod lingered. Like any hopeful lover, he stayed behind for a stolen moment with the heiress, certain that his fortune, both romantic and material, was now assured. Perhaps words were spoken too boldly, or the coquette revealed her heart to be made of lighter stuff than he had dreamed. Whatever it was, the poor schoolmaster emerged after a short while looking utterly undone, crestfallen, and hollow-eyed. Oh, women! Ever the riddles of men's undoing. Had she merely trifled with him to sharpen her conquest over Brom? Heaven knows. I do not. But Ichabod left the house like a thief from a hen roost, crestfallen, humiliated, his hopes in tatters. He did not spare a glance for the orchards or fields that had once filled his mind with golden visions. He strode straight to the stable, where with kicks and curses he roused old Gunpowder from his dreams of endless pastures and knee-deep clover. The horse snorted and stamped, and together, one weary in spirit, the other in bone, they set forth into the lonely, haunted night. It was the witching hour itself when Ichabod, heavy of heart and downcast in spirit, made his way home along the flanks of the high hills above Tarrytown, the same hills he had crossed so cheerfully that afternoon. The hour was as mournful as his mood. Far below, the Tappan Zee lay a dusky, indistinct breadth of water, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop, riding silently at anchor under the lee of the land. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the faint, far barking of a watchdog across the Hudson, so dim and distant that it served only to remind him how far he was from any friendly companion. Now and again, the long, drowsy crow of a cock, startled from sleep, drifted from some farm tucked among the hills, but it reached him like a sound from a dream. Near at hand, no life stirred, save the sorrowful chirp of a cricket or the uneasy twang of a bullfrog in a marsh, as though the creature had turned upon a troubled pillow. All the ghostly tales of the evening crowded back upon his mind. The night itself grew deeper. The stars seemed to sink into the sky, and driven clouds would at times swallow them from sight. Never had he felt so alone, so utterly forsaken. He was nearing the very ground made famous by those same spectral stories. In the center of the road stood a monstrous tulip tree, towering like a giant above all its neighbors, serving as a landmark to the whole countryside. Its limbs were great and gnarled, like the trunks of lesser trees, twisting down to the earth and clawing back up into the air. It was tied to the tragic capture of the unfortunate Major Andre, and everyone knew it as Major Andre's tree. The common folk regarded it with a mingling of respect and superstition, some for pity of the man whose fate had named it, and some for the doleful sights and lamentations said to haunt its branches. As Ichabod drew near this fearful sentinel, he began to whistle, and thought he heard an answer. Only the keen breath of wind knifing through the dry branches. A few minutes more, and he saw something white hanging in the midst. But peering closer, he found only a place where lightning had scarred the bark and left the pale wood bare. Then, a groan. His teeth chattered, his knees smote the saddle. Yet it was nothing but one huge bough rubbing against another as the breeze stirred them. He passed beneath the tree unharmed, but fresh terrors waited ahead. Some 200 yards farther, a little brook crossed the road and slipped into a marshy, thick-wooded glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs, laid side by side, made a narrow bridge. Where the brook entered the wood, a tight knot of oaks and chestnuts, woven thick with wild grapevines, cast a cavernous gloom over the water. To pass that bridge was a trial indeed. Here was the very spot where Andre had been seized, and beneath those chestnuts and vines, the yeoman had lain in wait. The stream had been called Haunted ever since, and many a schoolboy had crept across it after dark, with his heart in his mouth. As he neared the water, Ichabod's heart hammered. He gathered his courage, drove both heels into Gunpowder's ribs, and tried to dash straight across. The perverse old horse only lurched sideways into the fence. Ichabod sawed the rein the other way, kicked with the contrary foot. The beast started indeed, but only to plunge headlong into a bramble-thick tangle of alders on the opposite side of the road. Now the schoolmaster laid on both whip and heel. Snuffling and snorting, old Gunpowder rushed forward, only to plant his feet and stop so sharply at the bridge that Ichabod nearly flew over his head. Then a wet, heavy tramping by the bridge's edge pricked Ichabod's ready ear. In the black shadow of the grove, on the very margin of the brook, he made out something vast, misshapen, and towering. It did not move. It seemed gathered into itself, a hulking monster, crouched to spring. The hair on Ichabod's scalp rose at once. What could he do? Turn and run? Too late. And what hope had any mortal against a spectre that could ride the wind? Mustering a desperate show of courage, he stammered, "Who are you?" No answer. He repeated the question, his voice more shaken than before. Still nothing. He struck Gunpowder with his stick, and, squeezing shut his eyes, burst into a psalm tune with involuntary fervor. At that very instant, the shadow he feared shifted, and with a scramble and a bound, stood square in the road. Though the night was deep and cheerless, Ichabod could now make out the figure. It was a horseman of great size, upon a powerful black steed. He offered neither greeting nor threat, but kept alongside, upon the blind side of Gunpowder, who had shaken off his balks and now jogged on. Ichabod, who wanted no such companion, remembered Brom Bones's adventure with the galloping Hessian, and quickened his pace, hoping to draw away. The stranger's horse quickened as well. Ichabod tried falling back to a walk. The stranger did the same. A chill settled upon the schoolmaster's heart. He tried again to sing, but his dry tongue clove to the roof of his mouth. There was something in the other rider's grim, dogged silence that was more dreadful than any cry. The terror soon disclosed its full shape. They mounted a rise that threw the stranger's outline in stark relief against the sky, gigantic in height, cloaked, and, horror upon horror, headless. Worse still, Ichabod saw that the head, which should have sat upon those shoulders, was carried before him, cradled on the pommel of the saddle. Despair seized Ichabod. He showered kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping to break free in a sudden burst. The spectre sprang forward at once, full tilt. Away they thundered, through brush and mire, stones striking fire beneath the hooves, sparks spitting at every leap. Ichabod's flimsy coattails snapped like flags, his long body stretched out over the horse's neck, in frantic flight. They had come to the road that turns towards Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, as if possessed, swerved the other way, and plunged headlong down a sandy dell. The path ran 1/4 of a mile beneath a roof of trees, and then crossed the very bridge of goblin fame, just beyond which rose the green knoll, crowned by the whitewashed church. The horse's panic, for a time, gave his unskilled rider the advantage. Halfway through the hollow, however, the saddle girths began to slip. Ichabod grabbed the pommel desperately, trying to hold the saddle in place. In vain. He had barely time to throw both arms around Gunpowder's scrawny neck when the saddle dropped, and a heartbeat later was hammered beneath the spectre's relentless hooves. For one flashing moment, the wrath of Hans Van Ripper crossed Ichabod's mind, for it was the farmer's Sunday saddle. But there was no space for such earthly fears. The goblin pressed close. Ichabod, a wretched rider at best, was jolted from side to side, and then squarely upon the cruel ridge of the horse's spine, with a violence that threatened to split him in two. An opening in the trees shone, like mercy. The wavering glint of a silver star in the brook told him the bridge lay near. He glimpsed the church walls, ghost-pale beneath the boughs. He remembered where Brom Bones said the phantom had vanished. If I can but reach the bridge, he thought, I am safe. Just then, The black steed's breath flamed hot upon his shoulder. With one last convulsive kick, Ichabod drove gunpowder onto the bridge. The planks rang, the echo boomed beneath, and they shot across to the farther bank. Ichabod cast a quick, exultant glance behind, expecting the spectre to vanish in fire and brimstone. Instead, he saw the goblin rise in his stirrups, saw the dreadful arm swing, and in the next instant, the phantom hurled its head. Tried to duck, but too late. The missile struck his skull with a thunderous crack. He tumbled headlong into the dust, and horse, spectre, and whirlwind roared past into the night.
Morning found old Gunpowder without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not appear at breakfast, nor at dinner. The boys wandered to the schoolhouse and idled by the brook, waiting. No schoolmaster came. Hans Van Ripper, growing uneasy for the fate of Ichabod and of his saddle, set inquiries afoot. After some searching, they found signs along the road to the church. The court Sunday saddle, ground into the dirt. The prints of 2 horses, deep and furious, stamped in the road up to the bridge. And beyond, on the bank of a broad black reach of the brook, Ichabod's hat lying near a shattered pumpkin. They dragged the water, but no body rose. As executor of the absent pedagogue's estate, Hans Van Ripper opened the little bundle of worldly goods. 2.5 shirts, 2 neckstocks, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy breeches, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes, dog-eared beyond repair, and a broken pitch pipe. The furniture and schoolbooks belonged to the district, save for 3 volumes. Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a fortune-teller's dream book. Within that last lay a blotted sheet of foolscap, much laboured over, containing many failed attempts at verses in honour of the heiress of Van Tassel. Hans flung those magical books and the lovesick scrawl into the fire, and swore henceforth his children would never again be ruined by reading and writing. Whatever money Ichabod possessed, his quarter's pay, received but days before, he must have carried on his person when he vanished. The mystery was all the talk at church that Sunday. Little knots of gossips gathered in the yard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin were found. They recalled the tales of Brower and of Bones, and a dozen others besides, and weighed them against the signs they had seen. In the Abchand they shook their heads gravely, and agreed that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. He had been a bachelor, and owed no debts, and so the world moved on. The school was shifted to another corner of the hollow. The cord another pedagogue took his place. Years later, an old farmer, who had been to New York and brought back news, told that Ichabod Crane yet lived. He had fled the region for fear of the ghost, and of Hans Van Ripper, and for shame at being dismissed by the heiress. In a distant county he had kept school and read law, then taken up politics, campaigned at elections, written for newspapers, and at last had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. As for Brom Bones, who soon after led the blooming Katrina to the altar, he was always observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the tale of Ichabod was told, and never failed to burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, so that some suspected he knew more than he would ever confess. Yet the old Dutch housewives, who are best at judging such matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. The bridge grew more feared than ever, and perhaps for that reason, the road has since been altered, so that travelers now approach the church by the millpond's edge instead. The schoolhouse, abandoned, fell into decay, and was said to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. And many a ploughboy, loitering homeward on a still summer evening, has fancied he heard the thin, melancholy voice at a distance, drawing out a psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.
So our poor schoolmaster lost his head. in more ways than one. Old Knickerbocker said it best. Take life's jest as it comes. Because those who race with goblins should expect a rough ride. Good night. Dark encounters. Tales from beyond the veil.